For the longest time, video games have been associated with school shootings, bullying, criminal behavior, and violence in general. They say that video games cause people to become violent, aggressive individuals. However, that's like saying reading a sad book ultimately makes you a depressing person. I'm John Pedersen, and I'm here to tell you that those assumptions are wrong and to convince you that playing video games, yes, even the violent ones, could actually be beneficial for players. But where to start? The controversy that video games cause violence can be dated back to the 1970s. The decade Death Race was released. The objective of Death Race was to run over gremlins which resembled stick-figure humans. It was also rumored that the game's actual title was Pedestrian. People protested that the developers at Exidy intended to promote violence with this game. Despite Exidy's president Pete Kaufman denying this statement to the public, people still opposed the game and would even drag the Death Race machines from their arcades and set them ablaze in the streets. Soon after, the production of the game stopped, but the argument that video games are bad continued to rage on. As video games grew in popularity over the years, the graphics used in these games have advanced. Thus, characters in video games actually began to resemble humans as compared to the pixelated stick figures in Death Race. Games also began to become more bloody, more violent, and more realistic. As a result, people continued to argue that video games promoted violence as games portrayed more realistic violence. But how could video games, a seemingly mindless form of entertainment, cause individuals to become increasingly aggressive and more violent? One such study conducted by Josef Hansen, Laurent Bagu, and Brad J. Bushman stated that violent video games stress the player out, thus resulting in an increased level of aggression during and after playing a violent video game. These researchers argue that the cause of aggressive behavior in video game players is a result of the stress they experience from killing these virtual enemies. They studied the heart rates of players before and after playing a violent or non-violent game, and found that violent game players had an increased heart rate as well as showing increased frustration and aggression during and after playing their given game. Another study found that the amount of profanity in a game and the language used also played a part in the player's aggressiveness. Authors of the article, The Effects of Profanity in Violent Video Games on a Player's Hostile Expectations, Aggressive Thoughts and Feelings, and Other Responses, say that the harsh language used in violent video games is one of the largest causes of aggression in players. They stated that the profanity in games are easier to model than the actions portrayed in the games. As such, adolescents who play these violent games with a heavy amount of profanity are more likely to mimic the language they hear. In many first-person shooters, such as Call of Duty or Battlefield, players will often communicate with one another by yelling and shouting harsh language to one another. Children who are easily influenced will also adopt this form of communication, and as such, parents would often complain and blame the game companies for causing this sort of behavior in their children. So this would mean that there is a correlation between video games and violence, correct? This would mean that video games are actually making our children violent little juveniles, right? Objection! While these studies have shown there to be a relationship between video games and violent behaviors, nearly all of these studies have only been short-term experiments with researchers observing their participants while they play their given game and for a short period of time after they finish playing. There have been a few long-term studies which have attempted to find a correlation between video games and violent behaviors, but they have found zero relationship between the two. In fact, the relationship between the sales of violent video games and crime rates is negative. According to medical detectives Gael Farnes and Nidal Nabhan Abu, there has been a decrease in crime rates by 0.03% for every 1% increase in sales of violent video games. To get more specific, according to Procon.org, the arrest rates for juvenile murders has fallen 71.9% between 1995 and 2008. The arrest rates for all juvenile violent crimes has declined 49.3%. In the same period, video game sales have more than quadrupled. So if video games really were to influence violence, why is it that crime decreases as sales of violent games increase? Think about it. Think of the millions of people that have bought a Call of Duty or first-person shooter game. Think of the millions of people who have purchased a Grand Theft Auto game, one of the most controversial, most violent, and most graphic video game titles out there, containing nearly every mature subject under the sun. If video games really did influence violence, why don't we see millions of gamers out in the streets committing crimes? This is because video games provides a perfect controlled environment for violent thoughts or aggression. It was often stated that violent video games don't make people violent, but violent people are drawn to these violent games. This makes sense, since they can project their aggressions in the games without any real-world consequences, instead of performing their violent actions in the real world and dealing with real-world punishments. Not only can video games be an outlet for violent people, but those who aren't inherently violent but suffer from stress can also use violent video games to escape reality. By playing any kind of video game, the player is given a feeling of power and control, a feeling which that individual may not have in their actual lives. This feeling of control makes an individual feel better about themselves. It can relieve stress and aggression and helps them forget about any real-world problems which they might have little or no control over. This is just one benefit that playing violent video games, or video games in general, can provide. Video games can also promote social interactions and cooperation among players. Mainly I'm talking about MMOs, or massively multiplayer online games such as Call of Duty, League of Legends, Battlefield, or Left 4 Dead. Although most of these games contain violence, use of drugs and alcohol, and profanity, the main concept of these games is cooperation. Players of these cooperative games learn to work with one another to either gun down the enemy team, take over another team's base, or to survive a horde of zombies. Players will often help one another get better, providing tips and tricks while making a few friends along the way. Players gain worthwhile experiences by working with a team to accomplish a common goal. This sort of trait is something that players can take with them into the real world and can benefit not only themselves, but the group of people they might collaborate with in the future, either online or IRL. Some might argue that even if violent video games promote traits such as cooperation and team building, children should not be exposed to such violent content since a young mind can be easily influenced. While I agree that children should not be playing games with mature content, there are many other games out there appropriate for their age which can also benefit a young adolescent mind even if some violence is present. For example, the Legend of Zelda franchise. It's a popular fantasy role-playing game where the player can explore the world of Hyrule, fight monsters, and solve challenging puzzles. In order to win the game, not only do you need to be able to fight a countless number of enemies, you must also have good problem-solving skills, as puzzles and challenges in the game become harder and harder as the game progresses. Even some of the monsters require you to fight in a tactical manner, as certain enemies require you to fight using certain weapons. Zelda promotes problem-solving skills and challenges the player to think hard in order to complete their quest to save the virtual world of Hyrule. Although the violence in Zelda is much tamer and more cartoony than the other mature titles, it can still be considered a violent game, but also teaches the player that not all obstacles can be overcome from violence and power, that sometimes you need to use your wisdom and courage in order to solve a problem. Time for my final thoughts. We shouldn't be so afraid that violent video games are creating violent individuals. Think of a stereotypical video gamer. If video games really made games aggressive, we would surely see this in the public's perception of gamers, but we don't. If video games really cause people to become more violent, the crime rate should have increased as video games gained popularity. However, we've seen that as the sales of video games went up, crime rates went down. Playing video games provides a controlled environment and the perfect substitute for real-world violence without suffering real-world punishments. Lastly, video games can actually benefit society and those who play them since they provide social experiences which a player might not experience in reality. They can improve problem-solving skills and can teach an individual to work with a group and to cooperate in order to achieve a common goal. Violent video games, or video games in general, is just another form of entertainment meant to be enjoyed by people of all ages. If we look back into the past, people have also blamed rock music and television for causing bad behaviors. Video games has just become another scapegoat to blame. We should stop putting a negative light on gaming. We should just sit back, relax, and enjoy them for what they really are. Pure entertainment. Thanks for watching.